All right, hi everyone, and welcome. This video is about the Supreme Court of the United States, which was established by Article 3 of the United States Constitution. The first three articles of the Constitution each establish a different branch of government. The first, the legislative branch, which is the Congress. The second, the executive branch, the President and all of the other members of that branch. And then the third, the Supreme Court and all the other court systems. And this was done intentionally by the founders when they wrote the Constitution because they wanted to make sure that the courts would not be at the behest of the President or the Senate or the House, that they would be an independent political entity. And that way they wouldn't be influenced or endangered by actions of the President or the Congress. And so, for example, while Congress can create new courts as needed, lower courts, and abolish them as needed, they cannot touch the Supreme Court. Okay, so this insulated the Supreme Court from the political machinations that happen a lot of the time with King and Parliament. So the number of justices presently is set at 9, and that has changed from time to time. We've had anywhere between 5 and 10 justices total. A massive advantage of having 9 is that you've got an odd number. And so if there is a need for a tiebreaker, it's a lot easier to get that when you've got 9 people instead of, 6 or 8 or 10. Congress does have the authority to change the number of justices on the Supreme Court if they wish to do so. If they decided to decrease the number of justices on the court, they wouldn't just, kick off a couple of justices or however many they decided to decrease it by. They would simply wait for those justices to die or to retire before they did not fill those positions again. If they decided to increase the number of justices, that would be a big advantage for the president in office, and that's because appointment, the power of appointment, is the greatest authority that the president has over the judiciary branch. And that's because the president gets to select who the justices will be. The president also gets to decide who the federal judges are going to be. And that is extremely significant because when you are president, you're in office for 4 years, maybe 8 years. Okay, technically, constitutionally, depending on how you ascend to the presidency, you could be in office up to 10 years, but no more than that. If you, for example, became president you were the vice president originally, and then a couple of years into your term, the president kicks it or retires or something like that, and you ascend to the presidency. You could then be elected to 2 more terms in your own right, but that's never been used. That's not likely. So 8 years is the max that you get as president for the most part. And the ability to influence how the Constitution is interpreted, that's the main advantage of presidential appointment. And so since the job of the Supreme Court is to interpret the Constitution, okay, they interpret the Constitution and provide precedent. Precedent means that they are setting a legal standard for all lower courts to follow. Then that means that your interpretation of the Constitution, your style of interpreting it as president, will continue on for however long that federal judge or that Supreme Court justice remains in that position. So that's a really extraordinary opportunity. The average time for a modern Supreme Court justice to stay on the bench is 16 years. That's a long time to be able to influence constitutional decisions in the United States. And so presidents love to be able to appoint as many Supreme Court justices as possible. Okay, so it's hugely significant. Now, of course, that is up to, there's a check on that in terms of checks and balances. The Senate must agree whether or not they will approve that appointment of that justice. This was traditionally done by a supermajority vote of 60 or more. Just a few years ago, the Republicans in the Senate changed that to a simple majority vote because they knew they would not get the supermajority required. And so that was a slight change in something that we've had for almost 250 years now. So great opportunities if you are president to get to nominate Supreme Court justices. Now, removal from the Supreme Court is really fun. Justices can only be removed if, and this is a big if other justices feel they have not practiced what's called good behavior. Well, it should surprise no one that no justice has ever been removed from the Supreme Court because of not practicing good behavior. Partly because, well, okay, Supreme Court justices, they have a reputation for kind of being old. That's valid. and they're not in their partying days so much. The other reason for that is that the Supreme Court is responsible for interpreting the Constitution, and the Constitution requires the Supreme Court to interpret what does it mean by practicing bad behavior. The Supreme Court's never interpreted it, so we don't know. Basically, the Constitution means what the justices say it means, and if they don't make a statement on that, then okay, then that's something that we don't have defined. It's not been an issue. Supreme Court justices are not, wildly famous for their crazy parties. The qualifications for the Supreme Court are very surprising. The qualifications for the Supreme Court are the same as for federal justices in the United States, and that is none. There are no qualifications whatsoever for you to meet in order to become a federal judge or a Supreme Court justice. I always like to say that if any student is appointed to a Supreme Court justice or a federal judge position anywhere in the country, okay, before the semester's over, I'll give you an A for the semester. You don't even have to be confirmed by the Senate. So anybody technically can be a Supreme Court justice or a federal judge, but we have come to expect certain social qualifications. Background in law, for example. That's a biggie. Prior experience being a judge, having argued before the Supreme Court, etc. And then the purpose of the Supreme Court itself is it is the highest court in the land, and its ultimate goal is to interpret the Constitution. They do this by, again, setting precedent. That's a different word than president, guys, not talking about the person in the White House. Precedent means a legal standard that must be followed. And so when the Supreme Court sets a precedent, that means they have interpreted the Constitution to provide rights that were not prior to that time period being something that were enjoyed by United States citizens. So the purpose of the Supreme Court is to expand on those rights in the United States Constitution via interpreting it for modern times. And we'll talk more about that in another video.